Okay, let's unpack this. We've received a really fascinating stack of sources. It takes this ancient wisdom about conflict, correction, and kind of slaps it right onto the modern office desk.
Yeah.
It's a deep dive into judgment, false accusation, and this very counterintuitive idea why being publicly self-important can actually be way more destructive to a team than some hidden private mistake.
That's a perfect way to frame it. Our mission today is really to pull out these universal principles for ethical conflict resolution, and we're looking at a surprisingly relevant case study, this dynamic of false judgment. It comes from reflections on the book of Job, specifically chapter 22.
Right, Job.
Yeah. We're going to examine the psychology of the accuser, the really severe consequences of judgmental speech, and how that kind of toxic self-righteousness just completely undermines unity.
So the core stuff focuses on Job's confrontation with his three friends, who start out as comforters, but, they pretty quickly become prosecutors. And we're zooming in on Eliphaz, the kind of the harshest judge of the bunch, and what his accusations teach us about, say, modern team leadership. So let's look at the starting point. The sources really highlight that Job's friends, they began with what felt like mutual encouragement. They were there, initially to support him.
Right, that's key.
But that support just curdled.
Yeah.
And the dialogue quickly devolved into what's described as an angry and painful debate. That switch, that transition from support to, aggressive prosecution feels really crucial.
It is, and what's critical is that Eliphaz didn't just disagree, he fundamentally changed his role. He shifted from being, a compassionate friend to adopting this posture of a prosecuting attorney, like he's presiding over a judgment.
Wow.
Think about the setting. Job is totally isolated, vulnerable, sitting alone in the ashes. He's lost everything. And Eliphaz comes in basically with a legal pad, not a helping hand.
And the specific charge Eliphaz levels against him, the context of Job 22.5, that's what really gets me. It wasn't just simple moral failure, was it? What was the core charge?
The charge was pride or arrogance. Eliphaz essentially accused Job of acting as if his character, his good behavior, were so beneficial, so important, that he was trying to put God in his debt.
Huh.
The underlying theological error, which, it applies directly to organizational error too, was believing in this rigid system where suffering must equal sin.
Okay.
And where the person acting correctly must be doing it out of, selfish motives.
So if you claim you're innocent while you're suffering, you must be arrogant. You're defying the system. Eliphaz was applying this cold, inflexible framework, this idea of a distant God who's merely a detached judge of humanity. That's some intense pressure.
Oh, it creates a brutal 3-against-1 dynamic. Job was confronting 3 people who were, once his supporters. And they're using this superior legalistic viewpoint, the sources actually call this emotional blackmail, to definitively tell him he was wrong and must confess to something, even if he didn't know what it was.
Right, just confess.
Yeah. If you, the listener, have ever been in a meeting where, 3 senior people are trying to force you to admit fault just to fit their narrative, well, you understand the psychology.
Yeah, that makes the suffering almost secondary to the social isolation and the judgment. It's a truly toxic psychological situation. But then the sources pivot, right? They introduce this ancient legal principle about the measurable damage of this kind of speech.
Right. This is where we introduce a concept found in ancient Jewish legal thinking, which the sources highlight. They talk specifically about the destructive power of a slanderous or, excessively judgmental tongue.
Okay.
The code actually states that a slanderous tongue kills 3 people.
Kills 3 people. That's an almost impossible level of damage for just speaking words. We're not talking physical harm here.
No. It's existential relational destruction.
So who are these 3 victims? How does that work?
Well, they're destroyed in distinct ways. First, there's the obvious victim, the person who is slandered. Their reputation, their integrity, their peace of mind is destroyed.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, and this is where it gets really interesting, the victim is the person who does the slandering. Themselves.
Themselves? How?
They destroy their own moral character, their credibility, their ethical standing in the community. They basically poison their own well.
They poison the well with themselves standing in it. Wow.
Exactly. And the third victim is those who listen to the slanderous words, what the text calls the multitude.
Why them?
Because it poisons their environment. It corrupts their judgment. It spreads disunity, makes everyone suspicious, defensive. The sources note that in this cycle of Eliphaz's constant accusation, just Death filled the air all around. It destroyed the basic trust needed for any community.
That puts such a profound weight on every conversation, doesn't it? Okay, now back to Job for a sec. Eliphaz accused him of being prideful, acting like his character mattered too much to God. But the source material also gives us Job's kind of hidden conviction.
Right. Despite the overwhelming pressure and his complete ignorance of the divine plan, which, the source actually notes, was intended to silence Satan.
Okay, interesting detail.
Job maintained faith. He held on to the conviction that God would eventually achieve some purpose in his life and vindicate him. He maintained his integrity when everyone around him was demanding confession.
And that's the necessary counterpoint to Eliphaz's cold, sort of transactional theology. The sources confirm that, actually, the conduct of God's people is important to God. Our behavior brings him joy or sorrow. They cite passages confirming God is relational, not distant. So Eliphaz's error wasn't just in judging Job, but in creating all this unnecessary relational destruction based on a totally faulty premise.
And that relational destruction, that's the key link to our modern dynamics. Private failure is one thing, but public, self-righteous prosecution that causes systemic damage.
Okay, let's take that principle, that systemic destruction is worse than private sin, and transition it to, like, a modern office setting. The sources give this fantastic analogy about 3 professional managers working under one boss. It really helps you, the listener, grasp the different levels of severity based on their public organizational impact.
Yeah, this analogy is a perfect ethical challenge, really.
Yeah.
We have 3 managers, all committing serious misconduct, but they get drastically different disciplinary actions, and it's based entirely on the type of harm they inflicted.
Okay, lay it out. Manager 1.
Manager 1 committed, a private financial misstep. He embezzled funds from a vendor. It was containable, relatively private.
Right.
The boss required repayment, and the case was dropped without any public action. A serious failure, definitely, but handled internally.
Okay. Manager 2.
Manager 2 had a significant moral problem. He had an affair with a colleague. This was more of a 2-person problem, affecting internal relations, trust, that kind of thing. The boss asked him to resign voluntarily, quietly.
Okay. Now, Manager 3. This manager was senior, talented, contributed well to the bottom line, apparently, but
he was a massive source of disruption. Couldn't control his temper, constantly criticized the boss publicly, openly and loudly slandered colleagues who shouldn't have been blamed, created widespread disruption.
And the boss's reaction?
Immediately and forcefully fired him.
Wow. Okay, now hold on.
Yeah.
If you just looked at those 3 on paper, you probably think financial fraud manager 1, that's the worst, right?
Yeah.
That warrants immediate firing.
You think so?
So why fire the senior critic manager 3 so quickly while letting the embezzler and the adulterer leave more quietly? That's the question we got to dig into. Isn't financial crime objectively worse than just being loud and critical?
That's exactly the point, because the boss understood the difference between personal damage and systemic damage. The boss explained that while the first 2 committed sins, yes, serious ones that could be contained, the 3rd manager's actions had the most devastating organizational impact. His unseemly anger and his self-important public judgment created what the sources call toxic smoke, or poisoned air, throughout the entire department.
So he wasn't just breaking a rule, he was breaking the culture.
Precisely. The boss realized Manager 3 was wielding what those ancient texts called extreme killing power. He caused team disunity, destroyed the essential fabric of trust and cooperation. And the source concludes, pretty strongly, that the most intolerable type of person in an office isn't necessarily the one making a discrete mistake, but the self-important and arrogant individual, often driven by jealousy or pride, because their moralizing judgment and public criticism just makes team cooperation impossible.
That completely reframes how you think about workplace harm. It's not just about rule following, it's about the emotional, the relational stability of the whole system.
So we connect this right back to the ash heap and ooze, right? How do we make sure we don't become the Eliphaz in our modern relationships, at work or anywhere else?
Yeah.
The sources prompt us with these 3 really deep internal questions. How do you react to false accusations? How do you respond when you're outnumbered? And maybe the hardest one, can these unpleasant circumstances you're facing actually be part of some hidden plan working toward a greater good or vindication later?
Those questions really force you to look inward, don't they? To check if your impulse to correct someone is driven by, like, self-righteous arrogance, like Job's friends, or if it's coming from a place of wisdom and empathy.
The sources strongly advocate that when we're dealing with conflict, we have to prioritize wisdom, faith, and especially what they call greater tolerant love.
And this leads directly to the prerequisites for ethical correction.
Yeah.
Before you step into that role of prosecutor or judge, the source advises you absolutely must take these steps. You can't just rely on gut feeling or, anger.
Okay, what are those necessary steps? What do we need to do first?
First, you have to pause. Pray over the situation, which really means setting aside your own ego, your own perspective for a moment.
Okay, pause and reflect.
Second, calm down and actually study or research the issue thoroughly. Get the facts, not just your interpretation of them.
Get the facts straight.
Right.
And critically, third, avoid relying on perceived authority or old experience, which is exactly what Eliphaz did. Or trying to win by just being the loudest or speaking first.
That bit about avoiding old experience really stands out. Job's friends thought their seniority, their traditional knowledge, gave them the right to judge. They didn't research, they didn't pause, they just applied this rigid formula.
That's the exact contrast the sources draw between the ignorant and arrogant behavior of Job's friends and, say, the judgmental hypocrisy of the Pharisees later on. Judgmental words, if they're not rooted in verifiable truth and tempered by genuine love, they just cause discomfort and alienation. The problem is always that self-importance, dressed up as piety or moral superiority.
So if the real goal is unity, is resolution, then that kind of arrogant posturing is the single biggest roadblock. It's the source of that toxic smoke.
Absolutely. The final conclusion of the ethical principle here is that the higher goal, what the sources call unity and harmony, is only achieved when guidance comes from being sober, being guided by careful thought, and resulting in gentleness. When you correct someone, the aim should be to become a positive influence, not an aggressive prosecutor who poisons the air for everyone else listening.
Yeah.
So the lesson we can really extract from that confrontation in news and from that modern workplace analogy, it seems pretty clear. The greatest damage to any community, whether it's a family, a team, an organization, often stems not from those private containable failings,
Right.
but from public self-righteous arrogance disguised as justice. Judgment without tolerance and love, well, it's just destructive slander. And it always achieves the exact opposite of unity.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you prepare for your next critical conversation? Maybe it's with a direct report, a peer, even a family member. If the slanderous tongue kills 3 people, the slanderer, and the listeners, what's the specific inverse? What deliberate practice, beyond just, staying silent, can you adopt? How can you make sure your correction, when it's absolutely necessary, becomes a life-giving act of encouragement and genuine help rather than an act of aggressive prosecution? Something to consider as you move forward with this new knowledge.
Oh,